We are going to take a look at third declension. Third declension applies to nouns, adjectives, and participles, and it's going to be very important for participles, as we'll see. We've already covered first and second declension. Mounts has a summary statement on declensions in section 6.7 of his textbook. He says that nouns with stems ending in alpha or eta are in the first declension. Nouns with stems ending in omicron are in the second declension, and nouns with consonantal stems, meaning stems ending with a consonant, are in the third declension. These guidelines are valid but not complete. So stems that end in consonants are third declension, that is correct. But some third declension nouns have stems ending in vowels, for instance, upsilon or diphthongs. In addition, these guidelines can be hard to apply in practice. So determining the stem is not always straightforward. Let's look at some examples that we discussed when we were looking at first and second declension nouns. So we looked at doxa. The stem is doxa, and the case ending is null, technically called zero. And because the stem ends in alpha, this is first declension. Now let's take a look at pneuma. Well, notice that the nominative forms both end in alpha. But here the stem is pneumat, and the case ending is also null. Actually, the T drops out for the nominative form. Because the stem ends in a consonant, this is third declension. So we need more than just the nominative singular form to figure out what's going on with a noun and what declension it is. Now we can note up front that third declension is a large field. There's a lot of third declension patterns. There are about 30 different third declension patterns. But the most common third declension endings are the ones that we're going to see here. So in our table, we're going to see that masculine and feminine are the same, and then that neuter is a slight variation from the masculine and feminine. So we have the singular endings, and for the masculine and feminine, we have sa, as, I, a. I remember that as sasia. And then for the neuters, we have a null and then as, I, null. So one can just say as, I, sasia, as, I, The plurals we see under masculine feminine are s, on, sin, as, and for the neuters, a, on, sin, a. So s, on, sin, as, and a, on, sin, a. Those aren't too bad. This is a very common third declension ending pattern, and it is worth memorizing these. Here are a few third declension examples. We have the noun sarx, flesh. The stem is sarc, so sigma, alpha, rho, kappa. Notice that the kappa and the sigma of the ending combine together to get xi. This comes from our square of stops. And so we have sarx. And then we have as, I, a. So sarx, sarkas, sarki, sarka, sas, I, a. And then the plurals. This is a feminine noun, so it comes under the masculine feminine category. The plurals are sarkes, sarkon, sarksin, and sarkas. And again, we have the square of stops in play here. We have the kappa at the end of the stem combining with sin from the ending, giving us xin with that xi. So sarksin. But you can still see the endings here. Sa, it's combined with the kappa. Sa, as, I, a, es on sin as. Let's look at a neuter example. So we have the noun pneuma. So we have pneuma, pneumatos, pneumati, and pneuma. The neuter nominative has no ending, it's a null ending, and the T from pneumat drops off, so we get pneuma. Then we get pneumatos, there's the as, pneumati, E, and then pneuma, again, the tau drops off. See the plurals, we saw that was a on sin a, and so we see pneumata, pneumaton, pneumasin, and pneumata, so a on sin a. One note here, when we see pneumat bumping up against the sin ending, when tau and sigma combine, the square of stop says that the sigma remains and the tau drops out. So we just have pneumasin. The tau goes away. So that's still following the rules of the square of stops. So these endings are very important to memorize. Now a brief note here on determining declension. Now these are guidelines. These are not laws of the universe. These are guidelines. I call them rules of thumb. So use a lexicon and start with the genitive singular. In a lexicon, you will see the lexical form. The next piece of information you'll see is the genitive singular form. If the genitive singular form ends in alpha sigma or eta sigma, then the word is likely feminine and first declension. Remember, these are rules of thumb. If the genitive singular form ends in omicron upsilon and the nominative singular ends in omicron sigma or omicron nu, so the genitive is u and the nominative is as or an at the end, then the word is likely second declension, masculine with the omicron sigma lexical form, nominative, or neuter if it has a omicron nu as the lexical form, the nominative singular. If the genitive singular ends in anything else, the word is likely third declension. So these are some rules of thumb. They're not absolute laws like gravity, but they are helpful. A few further notes on declension. So there's some interesting cases. For example, we do have some second declension feminine nouns. So nouns in the class of hadas, which is way, you'll see the genitive ends in omicron upsilon, and the nominative form ends in omicron sigma, but notice that the definite article tells us this is a feminine noun. And there's a handful of these in the New Testament. One interesting example is limas, famine. The lexicon says that it has an omicron upsilon genitive, but then it says that it could either have a masculine or a feminine definite article. So in Luke and Acts, it's feminine. In other places, it's masculine. Very interesting. Another interesting class of nouns is the so-called TACE, agent nouns. Here the genitive does end in omicron upsilon, but the nominative singular ends in ace. So it does not follow our rule for second declension. And in fact, these are first declension, but they're also masculine. So an example is prophetes, prophet, or mathetes, disciple. But other than the genitive, these are all identical to first declension feminine nouns. So for example, the accusative singular for prophetes is prophetane. And so there's our typical first declension feminine singular, ain. Here's some examples. So we have basileia. In the lexicon, you'll see that the genitive singular is as, alpha sigma. And then the he tells you it's feminine. This is first declension. Another example, graphe. So we have eta sigma is the genitive singular. It's feminine. This is first declension. How about gune? Well, it kind of looks like it's first declension. I mean, it's feminine. But notice the genitive. It's Ikos. This is a third declension noun. It's actually kind of a weird one. It's actually irregular, but the genitive singular tells us that it's not a first declension. Next word is soma, body. Notice that very similar to pneuma, it's got an alpha, but if you look at the genitive singular, it's tas. This is a neuter, and it is third declension because of that genitive form. Finally, we look at oinos, wine, and we see that the genitive is omicron upsilon, oo, and the nominative singular ends in omicron sigma, so we have os, and so it's masculine, and this would be second declension. So these are some rules of thumb. Let's briefly go through some adjective patterns. Mounts talks about these in chapter 10. One of the patterns that we've seen for the most part up to now is the 2-1-2 pattern, where the masculines are going to be second declension, the feminines are going to be first declension, the neuters are going to be second declension. And an example is agathos. When we say the good man, we would use a second declension ending. The good woman, we would use a first declension, and then the good child, which would be a neuter, we would use the second declension neuter ending. So this is one that we've seen quite a bit of already. Another possibility is where you have a third declension for masculine and a third declension for neuter, but a first declension for feminine. And that happens for the adjective pas, meaning all or every. Another possible example is where you have second declension for all cases, where you have masculine and feminine in this case are the same, and then the neuter is slightly different, but these are all second declension. And aionios is an example, eternal. And one final example is where we see third declension for masculine and feminine the same, and then the third declension for neuter is a little bit different. And that's the example that we've been looking at so far. For the nouns, that's the pattern that we saw. So when we looked at the example for sarx above, sarx was the same for masculine and feminine, and then it was slightly different for neuter, but they were all third declension. So these are outlined in Mounts section 10.24. This is something to be aware of, but not something that you need to memorize at this point. Finally, let's look at a couple of very common words. So we have tis with the accent, meaning what or who, interrogative, and then tis without the accent, meaning someone or something. This is noted in table 10.11 in Mounts' book. Let's look at that real quickly. So I have this up within Accordance Bible Software. We see the table here, 10.11, and you see the various forms here. So masculine and feminine are the same. This is what we often see in third declension nouns, and then the neuter is still third declension, but it's a little bit different. So we still have the characteristic endings, sa, as, I, a, s, on, sin, as, and then as, I, a, on, sin, a. Similarly, for tis without the accent, we have the same endings. This is important to be familiar with. Very, very common pronouns. The other word that is very common and worth being familiar with is pas, and that shows up in Mounts' book, table 10.22. Let's look at that real briefly. Now, pas is interesting. It follows a 3-1-3 pattern, meaning that masculine and neuter are third declension and the feminine is first declension. So that's one of the adjective patterns that we saw. So it's worth looking at this table and becoming familiar with the various forms that pas can take. So we have this third declension, sa, as, I, a. That's what we expect for a third declension masculine. But for feminines, we have first declension. So we have the a, ace, a, on, and that's a typical first declension pattern for a noun, something like doxa, And then for the neuters, we have the third declension endings again. This is another common word that's worth being familiar with. Let's look at a few examples that give some practice in dealing with third declension nouns. So we have Luke 24:39 near the end of that verse. We have hati pneuma sarka kai astea uk eke kathos emma theoreta ekanta. This is a nice participle. We haven't had participles yet, but we will soon. So hati, that, and now we have pneuma. Now, as we said before, this is neuter, so it could be either nominative singular or it could be accusative singular. So we have to figure out from the sentence what's going on here. So we have pneuma, then we have sarka, and sarka comes from our noun sarx. So remember we looked at that a little bit ago. And sarka, in this case it's feminine, so it's going to be an accusative feminine singular. Remember sas e a, so there's our accusative feminine singular ending. So that's accusative, and then we have kai, and then we have astea. This comes from the noun astean, and if you look that up, you'll see that it's got a genitive of omicron upsilon, so this looks like a nice second declension neuter. And so we have a neuter plural here. This could be either nominative or accusative. Let's see what else is happening here. So we have that a spirit, flesh and bones, uk eke, and so we have not and then he has. So it looks like we're looking at the spirit is nominative and the spirit does not have something. So the subject's near the beginning, the verb is later, interestingly. So we have a spirit, flesh and bones does not have. So the word sarka is a direct object of the verb eke, have, and thus sarka is accusative. Note that sarka is accusative neuter plural. So literally we have a spirit does not have fleshes and bones, but we would translate this as flesh and bones. And clearly astia is also accusative. It's a direct object. It's accusative neuter plural, and so we have flesh and bones. So we have that a spirit, flesh and bones does not have, kathos as, and then we have eme, this is a nice accusative pronoun, and then theoreta. This comes from theoreo, and theoreo is to behold or to see. The eta ending is telling you this is second plural. It is another present active indicative, in this case second plural. As you see me, here's our accusative. As you see me, and then here's our participle. And it simply means having here, as you see me having. That a spirit, flesh and bones does not have, or we'd say a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see me having. Let's look at John 3:6 for a final example here. So we'll read it. Ta gegenemenon ektes sarkas sarx estin kai ta gegenemenon ektu pneumatas pneuma estin. So we have this participle here. It is either nominative or accusative. It's a neuter. The ta tells us it's either neuter masculine singular or neuter accusative singular. So we'll have to see what else is going on here. It means the thing that is born or the one that is born. Since it's neuter, it's probably the thing that is born or what is born. Ektes sarkas. And here we have a nice genitive feminine definite article. And so we know that it's a genitive, and sarkas, we see that as ending, which is a genitive singular ending also. So for third declension, remember our endings, sa, as, I, a for masculine, feminine. So we have a as genitive, and that's coming after the preposition ek, which takes a genitive object. So we're expecting it. So out of the flesh, sarx is flesh, or just out of flesh. And then we have sarx estin. So we have sarx here. That is nominative, feminine singular. We saw that this is a genitive, but that's coming out of this whole phrase here, ek te sarkos. And for completeness, let's note that estin is a present active indicative third singular form of a me, he, she, it is. The thing that is born out of flesh, and then we have flesh is. So is flesh. So this looks like it's a nominative over here, and it's the thing that is born is flesh. And so this is going to be a predicate nominative. Sarx is going to be predicate nominative. So the thing that is born, or what is born out of flesh or out of the flesh, is flesh. Then the second part, kai ta gagene menon, it's hard to say. And I think, again, could be either nominative or accusative, but it looks like if we follow the same structure as the first part of the sentence, he's now saying that what is born from something else, in this case, what is born ek tu pneumatos. So we have out of the spirit, another prepositional phrase here, ek tu pneumatos. This is also a genitive. It's an object of ek. This, of course, is from pneuma. And so what is born out of the spirit or out of spirit, and then we have pneuma estin. So again, a nominative, could be nominative or accusative, but following the same pattern, it's a predicate nominative. So what is born out of the spirit is spirit. So it's predicate nominative, and this is also nominative here. This neuter participle, as we saw in the first part, was nominative. This is also nominative. So what is born is being linked to spirit with the word estin. So what is born out of spirit, spirit is, or is spirit. So the thing that is born out of the flesh is flesh, and the thing that is born out of the spirit is spirit. So some practice with dealing with third declension nouns.